I think, of the rate you find in a place like the US, which probably has too many lawyers. But let me turn now to some other pieces of the story. I've given you the mixed picture, the on the one hand, on the other hand. I think the more interesting way to think about this is to look at the landscape in a way that takes account of some of the progress and some of the places where it lags. And I think gaps are one way of talking about this. If you look at Chinese law on the books, the one thing that is clear, I've given you all the things we don't know. One thing we do know is that the law on the books has gotten to be a lot better. It is immeasurably improved, as you all know, from the baseline of a generation or so ago, and it's been an evolving, moving target. So you can pick your field of law: contract law, company law, administrative law, criminal law and criminal procedures, foreign trade and investment-related law, or intellectual property law. In all of these areas, if you line up the law that's there now with what was there 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, each one of these has undergone an evolutionary process towards something that is much more sophisticated, much more familiar to the outside world, and much more world-class. And much of it has been through engagement with the outside world. Now, this in some ways has been a good thing, but in some ways it's also been a problem, because as the bar has been raised, the difficulty of translating the law on the books into law and practice has arguably become even harder. Part of it is that domestic agendas of reform started, to borrow a phrase from current cross-strait relations, started with the easy and moved on to the hard. Taking apart the plan, creating autonomy to make contracts, those are relatively easy things. Corporate governance, functioning securities markets, those are a lot harder. Getting rid of the most politicized things like counter-revolutionary crime, maybe not so easy, but pretty easy. Getting into how you handle non-governmental organizations and those who seek more input in the political process is somewhat harder. So in some sense, the issues that are being taken on now, that are being written into legislation, are ones where it is harder to implement the content of the new standards. The other thing is to say to Western and other outside promoters of rule of law and law reform in China, is be careful what you wish for, because you may get it. That is, many of these so-called world-class or international style laws have been adopted partly because they've been pushed by the law reform community, foreign governments, foreign investors, and others, and then it turns out to be a very difficult thing to implement. The WTO and intellectual property may be the most prominent example here, but there are many others. And so you get this also through Chinese law drafters who've gone abroad and studied these things. So if you look at something like the Uniform Contract Law, it includes, in the 1999 version, which still is with us today, notions of good faith and public interest. And those terms have very specific meanings in the countries they come from. It's rather hard to translate that into the PRC context. The company law and securities law does a similar thing with fiduciary duties and shareholder suits and questions of misrepresentation and disclosure. But these are all terms, again, which mean something, but they require adaptation and translation. So too, the engagement with international human rights norms has become much more prominent in the last decade and a half or so. It has cast a shadow over criminal law reform in China that has not been neatly translated, and perhaps the most striking example we see of this is the still pending status of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which China has signed but not ratified. So, as I'm trying to suggest, all of this has created one side of the implementation gap. When you borrow terms, the meanings, often common law meanings, because many of these are Anglo-American and sometimes Hong Kong origin, the common law meanings don't necessarily come in with them. In areas such as company law and securities law, the functioning of many of the institutions embodied in ideas like fiduciary duties, like duties of loyalty, care, and so on, and even the regulation of financial markets and such, really function the way they do, and more or less well, in their countries of origin and their systems of origin, because they have a set of public and private institutions that give them meaning and flesh them out. You have a financial press, you have law firms and accountancy firms with sophistication, you have institutional investors, you have a variety of actors who give some teeth and some meaning to these terms and then support their implementation and enforcement. As the bar has been raised, as the law in the books has gotten better, the implementation gap, I think, has become something more of a problem for the rule of law, or its evolution in China, in that now there's a risk of a loss of respect for law because of the problems of implementing it. That is, you aim too high and you miss, you wind up corroding the belief that this is something to be taken seriously and something to be pursued earnestly. You almost would be better off shooting lower, as it were. The other problem that has come in most recent years, and I think this is the big question looming in the next several years, is how much are we going to see a Chinese pushback against a Western model that has been seen as the thing to be adapted and largely implemented. We see this coming out of the financial crisis. We see this coming out of China's rise more generally. One hears a lot more, even in relatively narrow legal discussions, about maybe that model isn't so good. Maybe we need something that is more organic and locally developed. That said, though, I think there are very durable and hard to reverse political choices and preferences that have been based on looking to the outside world and market-style economic laws and so on, and that will continue to happen. Even if they are Jung in the old Qi-Jung debate, they are very good as Jung, and they're very good techniques for achieving the results that the regime wants to pursue. There are other pieces of the implementation gap which I think are much more domestic. That is, there are constraints that make it difficult to implement the laws on the books. There's a shortage of resources devoted to implementing and making the law function effectively. There's a shortage of training. 160,000 lawyers is not very many, and a lot of them are from, you know, the Anhui Agricultural Institute Department of Law. China has too many law schools now. The good ones are quite good. The bad ones are barely law schools. So the numbers often understate the problem. Courts remain weak and dependent on local government in particular and under party control in ways that are problematic for implementing many laws on the books. Corruption and low law consciousness among government officials and citizens is certainly part of the problem as well. And in this context, it is often perfectly rational, as a matter of self-interest, not to push legal claims very hard. And so you see a lack of push on that side. And it remains throughout, and it's an old point, but it's worth making, so much worth making that I put it up in yellow, which is, subject matter still matters. That is, Chinese law remains uneven, better on the economic side than it is on the political side. And I think that is some of the fascination you see with the Singapore model still among many of China's leaders, the idea that you can develop a robust rule of law on the economic side and contain things on the political side. The other issue, that's my time, I'm so sorry. All right. The other dimension, of course, is the one suggested by this map. Blue is wealthy, white is poor. China has an immense regional gap that accounts for a lot of the legal differences. Just to take Shanghai as an example, the contrasts are really quite striking. Per capita income is 6 times the national average. Shanghai has 10 times the per capita income of the poorest provincial level unit in China. Urban-rural gaps are more than 3 to 1. 1 in 6 lawyers in China is in Shanghai. Law firms are similarly concentrated. By any metric of educational level of judges, China has a very uneven pattern, and Shanghai and other cities like it are far, far ahead of the national average. There are some problems. Even in Shanghai, there have been the recent spate of concerns about attrition rate among judges, complaining about the low status that they enjoy, and so on. But by and large, it's at one end of a very broad Chinese spectrum. So some of the things I was talking about earlier are points of domestic contrast as well. Those litigant satisfaction surveys, if you look at things like perception of corruption, the degree to which the government officials will follow the law, fairness of adjudication, all of these assessments suggest a much better pattern in China's most developed coastal cities than in the poorer inland areas. On the anniversaries of China's entry into the WTO, there's been a lot of work done on how foreign investors and foreign business people view the degree to which local governments in different parts of China have honored their WTO obligations. Shanghai and places like it score much better than more backward areas. There have been some nice empirical sociological studies of courts in different areas, and the same story comes out. The more advanced affluent areas have courts which do a better job of issuing decisions that follow the law and which seem to be